Hello everyone, today is March 1st, 2023. We are again in Natural Pigments studio. My name is Tatiana Zaitseva and I am with George O'Hanlon today.
Hi.
So we will talk today about probably the most confusing concept. It's fat over lean, and it is probably third most important topic or most asked questions we have in our office always calling. So it's first people ask about um, oiling out, then second one is cleaning brushes, and of course the third one is
Fat over lean.
fat over lean. Before we talk about this, I want to mention we sent the newsletter, and since it's 1st of March, in in 1 week we will have International Women's Day. And ladies, we would like you to send us probably 1 minute or so introduction, who you are, and how you like our colors, why you like our colors, and maybe even show what you use the most in your palette. And then you will be featured on our next newsletter, which we every year we dedicate on March 8th to women's artists. So that's great opportunity for you to be viewed by how many subscribers do we have? Like
35,000.
35,000. And it's a great opportunity for us to meet you face to face. That would be great if you would do this. So I hope you see us well and you hear us well, because we had a horrible storm, a snowstorm, which is very unusual here in California. So for whole week we didn't have power, and we had every day 6 inches of snow. Today is the most beautiful day. So of course we are wusses compared to half of the country who probably dig in the snow now. But hopefully today will not be interruption, and we will what we will do now, we will have 13 minutes video, and so you can write in the chat your questions, and right after this video we will answer your questions. Is that, did I mention everything?
And I just wanted to let everybody know we're going to show some of the videos that we found on the internet, and we're not deriding anybody here, but we wanted to emphasize how confusing the concept is for the fat over lean rule. Is so confusing for so many people, and we see that in so many different videos. So we'll go ahead and start the program here.
Are we sure everybody hear us?
Yes.
Okay, good.
The fat over lean rule is a basic rule in oil painting, yet the rule appears to confuse many artists or is ignored entirely by others. Based on the many videos and articles on the internet, the confusion is multiplied. Let's take a look at some of the confusing videos purporting to explain the fat over lean rule. In the first video, a discussion between two artists focus on walnut oil applied to the fat over lean rule.
When you thicken the oil, when it is either exposed to the sun or heat, the oil takes on properties that make it feel more fatty. So even if it's the same amount of oil and it would seem to be the same amount of fattiness, it's the quality of its stickiness and its ability to go over top of another layer, which is the fattiness, increases.
Right, okay. Yeah.
Does thickened or bodied oil change how it is applied to the fat over lean rule than cold pressed or refined oil? The same artists continue their discussion about walnut oil in a different video.
So I get the walnut oil and as cold pressed walnut oil. But what I found is like when layering the cold pressed, you can you get into a point where you see the problems with like fat over lean, and it starts to kind of bead up like water on a surface. So,
because what is underneath is quite fat, so
yeah.
it doesn't sink in or
yeah, which was annoying. So I was using sandpaper and everything. So I realized I had this kind of small fondue pot that came with a slow cooker that I bought. And so I started using that, and I cooked it for 2 weeks, and that solved the problem where it created another type of walnut oil that was more fat over the previous layers better.
Okay, but then cooking for 2 weeks, meaning having it on constantly or during daytime or like?
I just leave it in. Yeah. I figured it wasn't gonna like explode.
According to these artists, not only is bodied oil fatter than cold-pressed or refined oil, they introduce a new factor into the rule, the phenomenon of beating up paint. In some videos, we find good explanations of the fat over lean rule. But then new issues arise when pre-mixed mediums are introduced.
Hi there. Today I'd like to talk to you about the fat over lean rule. This requires each successive layer to be slightly fatter and more flexible than the previous one. In practice, this will mean that the uppermost layers contain more medium and dry more slowly. Layering means applying fresh paint over a dry layer. If you paint fairly thinly, you can do this more accurately by preparing jars with increasing ratios of oil to Sansador. Stand oil is polymerized to increase its viscosity and binding strength. An alternative to using pre-mixed jars is fattening your color by combining on the palette when laying out, thinning more in the lower layers if required. If you don't want to reduce the consistency of your color, then an alternative method is to fatten your color on the palette when laying out. Slightly more stand oil is folded in with each successive layer.
Care was taken to provide formulas for mediums that can help artists achieve fat over lean. But at the end, there was no regard as to the amount of medium applied to the paint. This is also seen in a different video from Winsor Newton.
I'm using glazing and blending medium here, and I'm using burnt umber because it's a beautiful transparent pigment. Burnt umber comes from Umbria. It's a clay that's been burnt so that it's got a much richer, deeper, darker tone. I'm just mixing it into the glazing medium here, and you can see that it's got a really lovely, strong transparency.
A question arises when using mediums. What components of mediums are fat? Fat is the binder in paint, which includes oils and resins. So that means all oils, regardless of whether they are thick or thin, are equally fat. Resins include alkyds, damer, mastic, and other resins used in oil painting mediums. There are no fattier components. But what about solvents? Since solvents do not remain in the dried paint film, they are not fat. This complicates matters when using mediums containing solvents. To apply the fat over lean rule properly, we need to know how much oil and resin is in a medium. We can get an approximation by looking at the safety data sheet for the medium. Here is the safety data sheet of the glazing and blending medium. We see there is at least 45% solvent. The remaining amount is oil and resin. What about the popular medium liquid? How much solvent does it have? The safety data sheet indicates at least 30%. But trying to calculate the amount of solvent and the amount of oil and resin makes the fat over lean rule much more complicated. A few companies solve the problem. At least they claim to do so. Let's see how they present it.
Anyone who paints in oils has heard this before. Paint fat over lean. Well, come on boys, let's demonstrate. Fat over lean. Why paint fat over lean? Consider the inverse. Painting lead over fat leads to an unstable surface, causing paint not to stay where it should. But don't confuse fat over lean for thick over thin. I'm talking about fat. The sticky, oily, shiny stuff. And lean, you know, not fat. The matte, absorbent stuff. Even with this oversimplification of fat over lean, artists still struggle to know when they're painting fat over lean. I mean, I'm not a chemist. Are you a chemist? No, you're fat.
The company offers ready-made mediums they claim makes painting fat over lean easier and more intuitive than ever. All you have to do is start with the lean medium and then switch to the fat medium. There's a problem when we examine the safety data sheets of these mediums. The solvent content of the lean medium is at least 45%, but the fat medium contains at least 43%. Not much of a difference. Even if we ignore the solvent content of the mediums, a bigger issue arises. If we squeeze oil paint out of a tube, how much medium do we have to add to the paint so it still remains lean? If we add 20% of the lean medium, we've added 9% more oil or fat to our paint. But what if we add 50% of the lean medium to our paint? Now we've added 22.5% oil to the paint. Is it still lean? We are still back at the start, trying to understand how much oil or fat we must add to each layer. Let's summarize what we know about the fat over lean rule. The last applied paint layer is more flexible than the paint underneath. This also means applying slower drying paint over faster drying paint. We do this by adding a little more oil in the last application of paint than was in the paint layer just covered, or not dilute with solvent the last applied layer any more than the previous one was thinned. A better way to think about this rule is decreasing the pigment volume in each paint layer. This last concept has been used by paint technologists for over 100 years. It is known as pigment volume concentration, or PVC. I introduce this topic in the next video.
Fat over lean is a confusing concept at best. It has been explained in so many different ways. Artists use many different metaphors to explain it. Some even compare it to fat and lean ground beef. Yet few understand how to use it. In this course, we demystify the fat over lean rule by describing it in a novel way that simplifies understanding and applying it in your oil painting. Fat over lean refers to the principle in oil painting of applying paint with a higher oil to pigment ratio, which is fat paint, over paint with a lower oil to pigment ratio, referred to as lean paint. To help you understand the fat over lean rule, it is first essential to understand what paint is. One way to think about the matrix formed by pigment and binder is a brick wall. In this analogy for paint, bricks represent pigments and mortar the binder. Every mason knows there is an ideal ratio of mortar to brick. Too much mortar and the wall is weak. Not enough mortar and the bricks do not adhere to one another. A similar relationship exists between the pigments and binder in paint. Properties affected by the concentration of pigment in paint are hiding power, gloss, permeability, tensile strength, and abrasion resistance. The critical pigment volume concentration is the amount of binder to completely coat pigment particles, but not space particles apart. This is similar to the brick wall made with the prescribed amount of mortar between each brick. The dramatic and abrupt change in the behavior of paint that occurs when passing through the CPVC includes physical properties, durability, and appearance. To determine the oil absorption value of a pigment, linseed oil is added to dry powdered pigment until the powder becomes a coherent paste. This amount is the oil absorption value. Some pigments, such as lead white, are well known to absorb very little oil, while lamp black requires much more oil.
This has led many to conclude that dense pigments like lead white and zinc white are lean, whereas lightweight pigments such as alizarin crimson and lamp black are fat. Pigments at critical pigment volume concentration also form pastes. Paint in collapsible tubes is paste paint, which usually means the pigment load is close to the critical pigment volume concentration of the single pigment or pigments in the tube. Paint at its critical pigment volume concentration is less susceptible to sinking in, remains flexible, is semi-gloss, and it's durable. So next time you plan your painting, think of a brick wall. Your paint from the tube is the brick wall. Adding medium increases the volume of mortar. Adding solvent effectively changes that volume. If paint is applied at its critical pigment volume concentration, which is paste or thick paint, at any point in the painting, the paint film maintains its properties like a brick wall. Paint with thick paint, but paint thinly. While this may not be possible in every painting technique, painting with paste in thin layers can make the difference in your painting.
Okay, let's see who got it.
That last video, by the way, the segment that that I did prior to my losing the razor.
No, that was COVID beer.
Yeah, this is COVID. That was an introduction, or that was actually excerpts from a full-on course in paintingbestpractices.com. The course is 15 minutes long, and it goes into more of the explanation about what is pigment volume concentration, which is actually the correct way to think about paint. Fat over lean cripples most people because they're continually confused about what is fat, what is lean. In fact, some of your questions already indicate that. So that's why we're attempting to do this. And again, we see so many different videos and explanations on the web that it just confuses people more rather than helping them out. So we can take some of your questions, and we'll take one here from Uncle. Can you talk about your paste calcs in relationship to fat over lean? I assume they are lean, so I can add drops of oil to fatten them up. So what he's referring to there is paste mediums. So when you think about a paste medium, it is essentially a paint. The only difference is a paste medium has no color. I mean, visually it has an off-white color, but when you add it to oil colors, it completely disappears. It is a transparent type of paint. And so it is paint. And the key thing in the video and in the course that we talk about is when you squeeze paint out of the tube, it is close to that critical pigment volume concentration, which is that brick wall with the right amount of mortar around each brick, or in the case of oil paint, it is pigments with just enough oil or other type of medium surrounding each pigment particle to give it these ideal properties. Now, when you get paint out of the tube, it is slightly less pigment volume concentration than at its critical pigment volume concentration, because otherwise it would probably be too stiff to put in a tube. So certainly a paste medium, adding that to your paint would not necessarily decrease the pigment volume concentration very much, and hence you might call it lean. But again, we try to avoid using that term or the term fat over lean only because it leads more confusion than the alternative, which is what technologists have been using for the past 100 years, pigment volume concentration.
So basically, as long as you paint in with the paste looking color or medium, you're good to go from the very bottom to the very top.
Yeah. You can add a little bit of oil as you go, if you need, and to make the paint more spreadable. That doesn't really change the pigment. It does change the pigment volume concentration a little bit, but not disastrously so. And the next question we have from Al Matos is, I use a walnut alkyd medium as my first layer. My question is, can I apply your Venetian medium and oil paint as my next layer over the first layer? Well, you can. The good thing is that the alkyd medium tends to dry fast. And if we go back to the fat over lean principle, faster drying underneath, slower drying. So, and the Venetian medium is a little bit slower drying in that regards.
It's slow drying to compare to alkyd,
most alkyds, yeah.
but it's faster drying than any oil medium, just like oleogel or something. Yeah. So because it does have solvent, so you just need to remember, but they absolutely can work, and that would be the correct way. So first alkyds and then Venetian medium.
Right, but always keep in mind, you see, the issue is when you add lots of medium into a paint. Now you're changing the pigment volume concentration, and now you go into that territory where you have a lot more mortar around the bricks. Again, I draw back to that illustration that I use because I think it's a great way to visualize your paint film.
Although, of course, Venetian medium does have a glass, so there are particles there, so that helps.
Not much though.
But again, you need to remember this is so small amount, and so because we do hear people call us and they're saying, but after our explanation, they're saying, but glass is there. The glass is so minimum there. So just be careful. There's all mediums.
Now, another question here is, Uncle said, I never have any cracks yet. I don't measure too much. I do add a few drops of oil as I go, even into my mediums like liquid. I'm wondering if that's wrong. As you can see, no, that's not really wrong. Yeah. Adding a few drops doesn't change the pigment volume concentration too much, and that's not a problem. And what we're really saying, and what I said right at the end of that short video, and you can get a much wider explanation if you go to Painting Best Practices. And by the way, in the comment below the video on YouTube and in the comments on Facebook, I put the link to that course in Painting Best Practices, and it gives a very thorough, more extended explanation to it. And of course, you can watch it over and over again. But the key thing is what I said there is paint with thick paint thinly. What that means is use paint out of the tube and apply it in thin layers. That's the safest way to work with paint overall. And basically get rid of your mediums, unless you need a medium to do a special task like faster drying or something that area.
Or if you want to have a glass, for example, so that
add more gloss, yes. Yeah. And Kevin Costley asks, are alkyd mediums considered fat or lean? And as you can see, it depends. But you see, the medium itself is always going to be fat because no matter what it is, it's going to be containing just oil or resin. Sans, of course, any solvent that may be there, as we explained in this video. So any medium you add will increase the so-called fat, lowering the pigment volume concentration. That means less pigments and more binder, or going back to that brick and mortar, more mortar between the bricks. See, that's what happens. So that tends to change the paint film properties considerably. And so what we're saying is try to avoid using lots and lots of medium. Let me see here. Going through there, let me see. Alan asks, so there's actually no need for mediums and paint should be used right from the tube. Essentially, that's correct. Again, there may be times when you need a medium, like for instance, a lot of people ask about glazing, And there they tend to be very, very generous with the mediums. And that may be okay, but always keep in mind that mediums such as oils and resins yellow. And so the more yellowing medium you put in your paint, the more yellowing you can expect from that paint film. So one way to apply a glaze is to simply apply the paint very thinly, add a few drops of oil so that you can do that. Use a stiffer brush and apply the paint in a very thin layer. That paint will be just as transparent.
Or we have a very safe way to do that too. So we are talking about Impasta medium and Velasquez medium. And years and years we're already talking about then, as much as people can see when they squeeze from the tube and they think it's still like yellowish paste, or what is not even, I don't even know, it's not white for sure. But mixing with your color, it will dilute the color, and so you can make transparent layers with two of those mediums, and it's the safest ones because on top of the oil you still have the particle. They are transparent ones, so that would be good.
So again, and here's a question. It's in Spanish. Thank you, Guido. At least I think, yeah, pretty sure it's in Spanish. And basically, oleogel is considered a fat medium. Again, it's just pure oil. It's almost pure oil. There's an ingredient in there, fumed silica, very small amount to help it gel. But again, you're adding oil to your paint. So again, try to stop thinking about mediums being fat or lean, because as we showed, any lean, so-called lean medium, as we saw, it is actually fat because it's adding fat or oil or resins to your paint. So, so the simple way is to think about your paint and how much oil you're adding to it. That's really the best way to think about that. So, and what we're saying again, just to repeat ourselves, is using paints right out of the tube is really the best way to use oil paint. Adding perhaps a little bit of oil, and you could add a little bit of oil as you go in each layer. That's perfectly fine. Just avoid adding lots of medium. That's where we see most of the problems occur, is where people are adding lots and lots of mediums to their paint. Let me see here. Let's go on to see if we have some other. Eric Garnick, I work paint with a lot of medium, very high ratio of medium to paint. Is fat over lean a problem? It could be. And the reason, and by the way, this whole idea of fat over lean is really more of a modern idea, because we don't see it any kind of recording of it in artist manuals from the old masters. They don't mention these terms, but there is some idea behind it. And what they do, of course, is they're using their paint quite thick or with very little medium. And in fact, they didn't have pre-made mediums like we had. They basically had oil, and they had like maybe a bodied oil, and they had a cold pressed oil, and then they had some resins that they would use occasionally in glazes. So,
but again, we probably should ask what's the mediums. A lot of mediums. Sometimes people are talking about mediums, and so they will talk. Is that oil? Because sometimes people talking about solvents, and they just kind of like mushing all together. So, what kind of mediums again you using, Eric? So we will see if you will write later. Yeah. And,
but as we saw again, the solvents. It's volatilizing. It's not in the dried paint film, so it doesn't really come apart. It doesn't become part of the paint film. But the whole question, when we look at paintings like in the 18th century and the 19th century, there we see all of these problems where artists would put lots of medium in one layer, and then on top of that would have a very thin, faster drying, very so-called lean layer, or a layer with high PVC, as opposed to the layer underneath, which had a very low PVC. And so this always caused issues. We see a lot of these problems in Joshua Reynolds' paintings and many other painters that followed suit with that. Catherine asked, how does the surface contribute to fat over lean? Is an acrylic gesso leaner than an oil primed surface? So that's a good question.
Good question.
And the issue is really that all grounds are formulated, or at least the commercial grounds, typically are formulated with a very high PVC. And the reason for that is, and we go into this in the course where we talk about, as you increase the PVC of paint, you also change the properties of the paint. So for a very gloss paint, you have very low PVC, which means you have lots of oil, little pigment. And then as you increase the amount of pigment and the ratio of pigment to the oil, then the paint goes to a semi-gloss and then matte. And we see that paints with very high PVC tend to be very matte and more absorbent. And that's, of course, where grounds are formulated. So grounds necessarily have higher PVC. And the idea, what you're doing with fat over lean, is you're increasing the amount of binder, in the case of oil or resins, and as you do that, you're lowering the PVC as you build up in layers. So yes, acrylics are also the grounds there tend to be high PVC. The difference with acrylics, and the reason why they don't talk about fat over lean with acrylic paints, is because the drying and the drying mechanism, or the film forming mechanism of acrylic, is totally different from oil. And so the need to pay attention to the fat over lean is somewhat reduced, although not entirely eliminated. Another question from Mike: to cover large areas in block and stages and need more flow to the paint, what would you recommend? So a lot of people simply, they take paint and they add a lot of solvent to it. So in effect, what they're doing is they're staining the canvas or the ground on the panel.
More and more we talk about to artists, it's eliminate the solvents. And again, it's probably the most difficult part for people who are accustomed to paint for so many years with solvents. It's easy, but if you do want to eliminate the solvents, you do need to paint with oil. And in this case, you just need to wait longer, so therefore to start several paintings at the time. And but again, if you do use solvent and if you need to block, so then you do need to use a little bit of bodied oil, and that's essential, because if you from the first layers just doing your solvent painting ratio, and so what happened later, you will have a sinking in experience sinking in, and this is due to the first layer. And just exactly we were talking about the first the ground, it is porous, and then you're making another layer, porous layer with the solvent. So, and then like on layer 3 or 4, you realize then you suddenly have sinking in, and it's due to the exactly the ratio was incorrect. And so just remember, in first layer, if you do use the solvent, use probably like 10 to 20% of the bodied oil, which is stand oil.
And the reason for that, by the way, is, and this is where a lot of people believe, and in a sense it does to some degree, when you use solvents, it kind of subtracts out some of the oil. And the reason for that is because if you imagine this, you have a porous ground, as an example, an absorbent ground, and now you add a solvent into your paint and you apply that. The solvent reduces the viscosity of the oil so that the oil more freely sinks into the layer below it. And that's where you get the idea of sinking in. And as a result, that means the paint layer that you've just put on there has a very high PVC, because some of that oil that was in the paste paint has been absorbed down below it. When you cover it, of course, the next layer, some of that oil then tends to penetrate into the underlying layer, and that's where you get this domino effect with sinking in and this dull and matte area. So, like we said, it's Tatiana's recommendation there is the best way to avoid some of that. And by the way, we have another course on the paintingbestpractices.com website that talks about matte, glossy, and everything in between, and it talks specifically about correcting sinking in and how to avoid it in the first place.
Due to your questions, we probably will have so many courses, because every time we talk, we have these questions, and so we need better explanation, much longer than it's today here. So then we have courses on paintingbestpractices.com.
We have a question. Can you use oleo gel for glazing? Yes, and again, oleo's gel.
That was made.
That's exactly why we
for that
right.
for that reason.
Yeah, and again, what we say is it's almost pure oil, so adding it's just an alternative to adding just straight oil into your paint. That's all it really is, and but it's very effective, and a lot of people do like it. It's one of our best sellers. And again, we make, and we're telling everybody, don't use mediums. We make a lot of mediums, of course. But again, the reason why we make these mediums is because there are special times or effects that you need and you can't achieve with just paint and oil by itself. Curtis asks, can you give a few recommendations regarding drying time between layers and thinning for painting details? An eye in a portrait, for example. So drying time, we talk about hard dry. We've often talked about that, especially in the Painting Best Practices webinar and the workshop that some of you probably took. And we do talk about that often, and what that means is that you wait until the paint film is hard dry, not touch dry, and we go into the explanation of how to determine that. And that's really the best way to recoat or apply new paint. And in terms of paint thinning for details, there's no problem using a little bit of solvent, or if you still want to use solvents, or adding a little bit of oil to get those. But what a lot of people are doing is they're using so much, as you saw that one video about a blending and glazing medium. I was amazed how much.
I mean, you didn't show whole video, which probably should, because it's
you could go look at it. It's really amazing.
Yeah, exactly. They show then over fat layer. She's applying that very thin layer with the solvent, and it's disaster. And
it's just so much medium is added to that paint. It was quite remarkable, and again, all of that material, and in that particular medium they use dammer and oil. It's going to yellow, so that's going to be a big problem later on. Marcel asks, can you expand on using Velasquez medium? Velasquez medium is one of our paste mediums, and a paste medium again is like paint. It has oil and it has an extender pigment. Extender pigments are white pigments with a low refractive index so that they're transparent. So it's the same. So if you add, let's say, a Velasquez medium to your paint, you're essentially just think of it just like mixing two different colors, except one is transparent. Christine asks, you talked in a previous video about barite. Adding barite to colors is a simple way for glazing. Is it a good way for fat over lean? So again, what you're doing, think about it. Barite is an extender pigment. So when you add the powder directly to your paint, what are you doing? You're increasing the pigment volume concentration. So in a sense, or not in a sense, but directly, you're creating leaner paint. So you're changing the pigment volume concentration, you're increasing it, and now you've got a leaner paint. So think about that. Again, we emphasize trying to think about getting rid of the whole idea of fat over lean because of all the confusion in regards to it, and think more about your brick wall or your pigments with the binder.
But again, if you're talking about pigment, but if we are talking about, Christine, if you are talking about paint, what we have, so then you basically don't change anything in ratio. So your ratio is absolute here. So if you mix any color, maybe just like, okay, so here probably would be another question, because we had this on cohorts meeting. So what would be like, okay, if you are doing alizarin or probably some of the very known organic pigments like phthalo, so they will have a little bit more oil than, let's say, natural colors or iron oxides, which they very lean compared to. And and of course, bright is very, I can't even say lean color, but it doesn't require a lot of oil. So therefore, you can just take your bright and just to make glazes with bright. And on top of that, remember how many, actually we had already several sessions about this, and bright makes this a little bit more brighter, which is we still need to investigate why bright is so important, and so why it's like doing whatever it's doing. Bright is great color. I mean, no color.
It's not a color.
No color.
Again, it's an extender. So we tube up an extender pigment for those individuals that want to experiment with barite. So Tanya was talking about the tube version, and I was talking about the powder.
Yeah.
One thing to keep in mind too, by the way, and again, we explain this in the course, that the link is on the bottom, is that there's really no such thing as fat and lean colors. You see, in the video, I talk about the fact that some colors absorb a lot of pigment, such as lamp black, and some colors like lead white absorb very little pigment. Barite is actually one of those too.
But that's by weight.
But that's by weight, exactly. And that's by weight. And that's very confusing to people. But by volume, almost all the colors on your palette, the volume, the critical pigment volume concentration for most pigments on your palette is between 45 to 55%. So in reality, there's no such thing as a fat or lean color. They're all about the same. Now, there are a couple of outliers. Lamp black, umbers, and sienna. But those are about the only outliers in this whole system, which is remarkable. So again, getting rid of that fat over lean idea, it's so confusing to people. And again, if you just think about the pigment volume concentration, which, by the way, paint technologists, paint formulators, anybody dealing with paint, that's 101. That's the first thing they learn. Pam asks, is it okay to use the same amount of oil in each layer instead of more oil in each layer, just not less oil over more? I don't see any problem with that. You're basically keeping that pigment volume concentration at the same amount, and that shouldn't really pose much of a problem. And again, the problems occur mainly because of several things, and that is the drying time of the paint. So if you have slow drying underneath a fast drying, the issue is that you're either going to get alligatorine, which shows up very rapidly, or drying cracks, which could actually show up much later.
It's a great question. Next one.
Glazing mediums are normally fat, right? Again, get rid of that idea.
No, but, okay. Yeah, of course, get rid of this idea. But, again, that's why we started from the video. And again, it's nothing to say bad about the companies, but it's confusing. You always, whatever you buy, whatever medium, paint, or I don't know, whatever supply you buy, please read SDS sheets, because it's immediately will click on you what is what. Because if we will tell you, so glazing medium, for example, oleo gel is glazing medium, yes, it's fat, but then you will take fat and lean glazing mediums from another company, and you can see then there's basically no difference between two of them. And it's like, so where you start, so you start with lean, medium, where do you finish with, like, is that on first layer, is that on third layer, where you start second one? And so this is the confusion. And on top of that, I mean, we didn't even put the videos which is on internet, how men or like artists making for themselves. It's amazing. So one takes half of the jar of this, put half of the jar, but then divide it and put more of this and less of that. And it's I don't
so
even know.
complex.
I don't
It's
even
just-
know how people paint when they have a time to paint. They just need to calculate where the.
So that
here's-
means they have calculators on their
Yeah.
palette, and they're trying to
Not even. It's worse.
or
It's
or
like
balances
it's just
or
like
things like that. It's
picking
just-
whatever. You know, it's
it
like-
gets pretty insane, and
Yeah.
and you stop painting, and now you're just trying to figure out what you're doing. Again, what Tatiana mentioned, of course, very important. You have to look at how much solvent is in the glazing medium to know how much oil and resin you're adding to your paint. And again, what someone may think is lean, as we pointed out in the video, but with total disregard to how much they're actually adding into their paint, it doesn't make any sense. Pat asked a very good question.
I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
but
Mhm.
Uncle 16. Yes. The question is, so normally very fat. Normally, yes.
They're increasing they're decreasing, excuse me,
Yes.
the pigment volume
Yes.
concentration. So
Yeah.
anything you add to your paint decreases the pigment volume concentration. Pat asked, would you talk about stand oil a little more?
Hi,
So great. Stand oil is a bodied oil. And by the way, we don't use the term bodied oil
No,
because
with stand oil. We use body.
I'm sorry. Yes, that's correct. We don't use the term stand oil because stand oil is an arcane term. It's an anachronistic term from the 19th century, how they used to make bodied oils. And in essence, a bodied oil is a cold pressed or refined oil that's been heated up until it thickens. You see, oil can cure or harden in two major ways. One is through exposure to the air, and the other way is thermally, with heat. So while you can see paint thicken up when exposed to the air and eventually dry, you can do the same thing with heat to the point where if you heat up oil, it'll actually turn into a solid mass. So a stand oil, or better said, a bodied oil, is actually an oil that's been thickened and it's on its way towards drying. It's partially polymerized.
By the way, next AMA is about oils. So
Which we'll do later this month.
Yes,
Yeah.
we already started preparing for that one. So look for our notifications, and so we will cover every oil what we have. If you have any questions, please send us to questions specifically. You can put this on service@naturalpigments.com. If it's something specific for your applications, and so then we can cover that session. But we will have that because it is the big question, and we do understand then before it was like this. You go to store and you see the stand oil from the company, and that would be just one stand oil and one linseed oil or walnut oil refined. And yes, we do have probably like what now, I don't know, we lost couple of oils and then we gained couple. I think we have like around 15 oils on our website, and each of them have specific application. That's why we, every time when you call to us, we explain to you what you need and what you don't need. So next AMA will be very important to hear, and please give us your questions.
Next question from Kevin. So is there any problem structurally with using large amounts of paste medium? Is the medium as strong and flexible as the paint? Good question. So here's the key to think about that. While you can add a larger amount of a paste medium to your paint. Here's one thing to keep in mind. It is transparent. So as you increase the transparency of paint, then you also, because what you're also increasing the potential for yellowing at some point in time. Not as much as oil, of course, adding oil directly to your paint, but at very large amounts, yes, like people adding, 50% or more of the paste medium to their paint. That could be a problem. It all really depends on the pigment that you're adding it to.
Which colors you use.
Because if you're adding it to transparent pigments with low refractive index, then of course you're increasing, the more you increase the transparency of the paint layer and the more oil that's in that paint layer or medium, resins and so forth, alkyds, then the more potential for yellowing, because pigments hide the yellowing and they hide it very effectively. But the less amount of pigment in there or the more amount of transparent pigment, then the less ability for that pigment to hide the yellowing. So that's a key thing to understand. And again, we can't give any say, 50%, that's all you can do. No, it could be more. It depends on the pigment. Is the pigment very opaque? You can probably add more and so forth. So now the other question, is that as strong and flexible as the paint? Well, each color, that's the one unique thing about oil paint, is that each pigment reacts with the oil differently, so that even each color can have a different flexibility and strength. Lead white gives oil paint its strongest and most flexible paint films. But zinc, on the other hand, make paint the most brittle and but strong. And then you have paints like ochre, which make a flexible but weak paint film, and other colors. So there's a whole spectrum to that. The key is, if you're using the lead white, which is the strongest paint in oil paint, and again, this only applies to oil paint, then you strengthen, and lead white is used with almost everywhere on your painting, except perhaps the darkest shadows, and so that means that your paint will be stronger. So in that regards, those mediums, for instance, the paste mediums, don't add strength to the paint film, but they make flexible but somewhat weak paint films. That's why we urge people to use lead white.
But overall, paste mediums are much safer than adding oil. Or some kind of medium overall. Mallory asks, I hope I pronounced your name correctly, I've heard many say that fat over lean doesn't matter when you paint alla prima. Is that true? And yes, that's true, because you don't have discrete paint layers. So you have one paint layer, so the fat over lean doesn't apply there. Pam, let me see here. Pam says, just a thought, from cooking and healthy eating, it doesn't matter what oil you use, butter, olive oil, coconut oil, safflower oil, they are still all fats. And yes, that's correct. That's the same thing with here.
Bodied oil, walnut oil, safflower oil, doesn't matter what oil it is, it's still a fat.
Yeah.
Let me see. I assume if you finish in 1 day alla prima, yes. Just so we said, it doesn't matter. Eric asks, if layers are completely dry before application of the next layer, is the fat over lean really a concern? Again, there are some caveats to that. It may not be a concern if you're really using very thin layers. But the issue comes into, and why it's really dangerous to give overall recommendations, because then people take that and they think it applies to every circumstance, which it doesn't. So I would say not entirely. If you paint very thinly, maybe it doesn't. But if you're painting, with impastos and thicker layers of paint and so forth, yes, it could. So that's why you need to be a little bit cautious about that. Derek asking, when adding bodied oil to solvent on the first layer, does this apply even to imprimatur or staining the canvas, or only to the first layer after that? It's at any time you use a solvent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you would want to add bodied oil. And again, if you look at that other course, matte, glossy, and everything in between, it explains why that is the case. Let me see. Uncle says, I wonder if all oil dry at different rates. Yeah, they do.
And we will talk about this on that because it's such a broad,
subject for that. Alan brings up a very good point here. Is varnishing between layers an option to prevent sinking in? It's
Alan,
it's
we already talk about this so many times.
It's what a lot of people do. In fact, it's been recommended. In fact, we've seen demonstrations where artists were spraying on a varnish between layers. And what I call that is puff pastry. And what I mean by that is, if you've ever seen puff pastry, all the layers of the pastry are coming apart. And that's because varnishes, which are made of resins, have a different solubility than oil paint does. Oil paint is very resistant to many solvents once it's completely dried or cured, whereas varnishes don't. So anytime you use a solvent on that paint layer, it will cause that varnish layer to swell, and it could even cause delamination of those paint layers. So that's definitely not recommended.
So we did cover that, and again, it's unfortunately, but teachers are still teaching this way, and again, just
sinking in. Sinking in is a problem that so many artists have, but the solution is very simple. It's incredibly simple. And again, like I mentioned, if you keep your paint at its critical pigment volume concentration, you're going to have less sinking in.
But the problem again, we always mentioning this, if you do have one at the time, and so like next time you paint it and you do have this problem, so that means it's something wrong with your ground, with the if you paint on, especially if you do paint on canvas. So because canvases these days don't have enough ground, enough layers, very thin. So if you experiences this, so then please do that. Like if you don't want to use lead ground, which would be the best for the oil paint, so but you can use just any other like titanium ground and apply a couple of layers on top of that, and you will see then it will the sinking in should not be as bad. And plus, if on first layer you will add a little bit of bodied oil, so then that will prevent to sink in all other layers after that.
Another question, so oiling out is not recommended. So the purpose of oiling out is to match a wet paint layer, or excuse me, the dry paint layer. So you oil it out so that it has the sheen, because it's dead matte. So you correct the sheen, you add the sheen, so now the value, the tonal value of that paint layer is correct, and then you're applying a new layer of paint, fresh layer of paint on it. That's the purpose of oiling out. Now, a lot of people think are oiling out, but just they oil out the entire painting between layers of paint for no other reason, and that doesn't make any sense. You're adding more oil, which is greater potential for yellowing, so that's not a good idea. So oiling out may be absolutely necessary to do what we just explained, but never oil out as a final layer in the painting, and you can probably guess why. You're just simply adding a film of yellow over the painting.
And never yellow out,
oil
out with varnish. Never do this. And if you do, just make exactly area where you don't see the value. So just put the oil out there, and of course, probably somewhere people ask what's the best one. So you can just oil out with oil, or we have a product called oleo gel, and you apply just the smallest amount on your finger or on sponge. We have sponges, and wipe out completely. So then the value will be back, but you will not have this extra or excess of the oil. And so the fume silicone oleo gel helps to grab the next layer of the paint.
And again, if you've finished your painting and you've got all this blotchiness, and again, that's covered in that course, matte, glossy, and everything in between. So if you end up with a final paint layer and it's all blotchy, the best way to correct that is with the varnish.
Mary Cornish Hicks, so happy belated birthday. So see you soon,
Thank
I
you.
guess, on Portrait Society.
Mallory says, a few painters who use liquid ignore the fat over lean because liquid dries in flexible layers. I guess because they believe cracking won't happen due to the flexibility. In reality, alkyd mediums actually dry to somewhat brittle, and let me just put a caveat in that explanation. So alkyds, depending on the type of alkyd and its application, can dry in combination with a pigment, of course, not by itself, to a somewhat flexible layer. But what they do end up doing is they end up becoming harder, faster than oil paint does. Oil paint takes much longer to cure, and as it's curing, it's becoming more and more, typically, in some cases, becoming stronger, some cases more flexible, some cases more brittle, and the same thing happens to alkyds as well. So we always have to keep that in mind. And again, the whole issue is not so much about the medium, it's about the pigments involved, because the pigments have the greatest impact on oil as well as alkyds.
So basically, the idea is if you paint with alkyd, it would be better to stuck with alkyd all the way, yes? And so if you use alkyd, so then you use very sparingly, like with oil colors, yes?
Alkyds are probably the only resin that would be safe to use in painting because it has a greater affinity with oil. Alkyd is a resin that's actually made from fatty acids of oils, and in addition to that, it dries in a very similar fashion as oils. So yeah, alkyds are good mediums, but as Tanya mentioned, if you're going to paint with alkyds, then stick with it throughout the painting.
And the worst, of course, then when artists use the liquid in between the layers, and then they varnish with liquid. This is the worst idea. So we should not use the same.
And
same
Winsor
materials.
Newton doesn't recommend it anyway. So Colin asks, what happens if you paint on a metal aluminum? Do the generic rules apply? I'm not sure what rules you're referring to, but all the rules apply. It's just that because you're on a rigid support, the issues that are caused by the support are no longer present. So that's a
little bit easier.
That's a big thing.
Yeah, because it's not seeping through the canvas, and so yeah, probably easier. It's always easier to paint.
You end up having less issues because the flexibility, let's say, of canvas, and to a much lesser degree wood, causes issues in the painting itself.
So the metal is
not just for the longevity, by the way. So using a absolute rigid support is great. Uncle, one comment I would make thank God for restoration experts. The only issue is they're not saviors. So if a painting is going bad,
and we see that
there's not much they can do. They're only intervening with an issue and trying to slow down the process that's going on, the degradation issue. They really very often cannot fix the problem. What they're doing is simply interventions.
But again, when we talk about restoration of the previous century, it's quite like predictable. So we had that many materials. Yes, products is the wrong word. And so basically scientists know exactly where, what, and so, but these days, what artists do to their art,
They can't help them. They're beyond repair.
I mean, they're great people. You know, they tried hard, but it's not all of your painting will survive. Let's put this way.
A good example is Joshua Reynolds' Lorth Heathfield. And that painting, there's a paper on it published by the National Gallery in London, and it talks about the fact that it can no longer be restored. It's just absolutely in terrible condition. So that's the kind of an example we have. Catherine asks, so if you are always painting at the critical pigment volume concentration, using maybe a little bit of bodied oil from the first layer, can you totally avoid the need to oil out in between layers? And again, oiling out is just simply an act or a practice so that an artist can match a fresh color to an existing color that is sunken in, has become dead matte. So you can probably avoid some of that because you will probably avoid some of the sinking in. Not entirely, because that is dependent on the ground. And it's also dependent on some of the colors. Some of the colors have a greater propensity for sinking in, umbers and some blacks as an example.
I love this next question. Of course, like I said, we will talk about oils next our AMA. But so can you read that question?
Oiling
and I will
out as
answer.
oleogel, and I guess rather than using sun-bleached linseed oil.
And again, I would love to sell for you the sun-bleached linseed oil or walnut oil we do make here in our factory. And walnut oil we made, last batch we made 3.5 years, almost 4 years. And so that's how long it took
Takes a
for
long
us
time to thicken.
to
Yeah.
thicken. And but this is absolutely not necessary to spend that money, especially for oiling out. So oleogel is a very inexpensive way to do this. And why we don't recommend sun thickened walnut oil or linseed oil for this reason? We will sun-bleached. We will talk about this next time because it's rather we need to cover several topics before we say like no you can't, or yes you absolutely can, but it's just money to the wind.
Spike oil, does spike oils also cause sinking in or other issues if used instead of a solvent in the underpainting when mixed with paint? What is spike oil? It's a solvent, so it's the same thing applies there. So it's just a much slower drying solvent. And if you're interested more about that, what is spike oil, how is it used historically, and is it really non-toxic? There's an article on the blog section of Natural Pigments. Just look up spike oil there. Catherine asks also, when you say bodied oil, does that include stand oil and or sun-thickened linseed oil?
Yes, all of them.
So bodied oils, all bodied oils, whether it's been thickened by the sun or by heat or anything else, they're all in that same category. Regarding painting alla prima painting following fat over lean, does that need to be considered?
No,
We've answered that, and no, it doesn't. No. Let me see. Going on here. Let me see. I'm not sure. Tella Passand, thank you very much for the shout out. I hope your students get a lot out of this, so we hope the best to you. Uncle says, are your lessons available on disc or are they just live lessons? They're not live, they're actually pre-recorded. So on the Painting Best Practices website, so you can view them over and over again.
So for now, it's full course. We have several courses already separate, small ones.
Small courses.
And we do have full course, and it's still, I think, we offer until sometime $450 for the full course, which we, again, it was live, not anymore. We're now too busy. No, I'm joking. So it just we are
We've got
busy.
so many things to do. Yeah.
So we would love to. We did like to see artists face to face, but it's not happening right now.
Pat asked, would you speak to what your Venetian medium would do? We can, but there is a video on that specifically, and it's in the Rublev Colors YouTube channel. And that is where you're going to get the most information. We show how it mixes. So that's much better to look at that than for me or for any of us to talk about that just off the top here.
I love to talk about Venetian.
Well, it's an interesting medium, but
again, Pat, remember then it does have ground glass, but because it does give special property to the paint, but again, as much as it's romantic, and so we are talking about then Venetians were using the glass in their painting, and so it's refractive index of the glass almost the same as the oil, but just because it's the particle, so it's kind of like it's making dimensional, three-dimensional look to the paint. But again, if you do want to have like jewel-like finish, so then Italian varnish will be better. So, but we do cover that. And if you have any question, just call us. If you saw the video and it's not like you didn't take all 100% information, you don't understand something or you don't feel like, call us.
Holly asked, very good question. If you want runny paint, should you only really do that with oil? And the answer is, don't do runny paint. And I know that sounds to some people that sounds why can't I do runny paint?
It's now pandemic, so everybody's now looking how it's liquid, and therefore. We always talking about, guys, you pushing materials to do something that should not be, and oil paint should never was in history, and it really should not be liquid, because
we have to understand that there's limitations to materials. You can't just do anything you want with a material because it obeys. We may not try to obey the universal physical and laws out there, but the materials do. And if you're trying to make that material do something it was never intended or cannot do, you end up with a disaster. And that's the problem. It's part of the problem in our educational system about art materials, because no one comes along and says, this is what you can do with this material and this is the limitation. And the limitations are actually great, and because they push us into an area where it really challenges us. And when we are challenged, we always do better.
And again, see, that's why on painting best practices, we always say, and then we give you rules, like we give you so many rules. But on the end of the course, we are every time saying then, you absolutely can't break the rules as long as you know what rules are. And so then you know what to expect. But what's happening right now, so people just, slumping the paint to the canvas and then expect that to survive. And so we do work with museums, and unfortunately, what happening to 20th century art, it's much worse condition than any other centuries. And so we are trying now single-handedly, with Virgil helps or we help Virgil. So it's I think it's three of us just going to tell you what, please don't destroy your paintings.
Okay, we've got a lot of comments. Thank you. We're getting
wow,
we're actually over our time. But there's a couple of questions I would like to answer here. Marina asks a very good question. What about combining Galkids with cold wax and pigments? That's a whole different topic. And when you go down the road of cold wax, you're asking for a whole world of hurt. And I'm not talking about adding a small amount of wax to your paint. That's probably okay. But what we're seeing today is really a big potential for disaster later on. So
And reason why? Just
the basic reason is that wax doesn't dry. It's a solid, and it also is very susceptible to solvents. So now you've got two very different systems incorporated into one another, and it's going to be a big problem. In the future, we're going to discuss that in much more detail in some future video. A lot of comments about Bob Ross. I can't speak much to his technique, and really don't care to do that too much at this point. And let me see. Thanks for the shout out about loving my beard. Thanks, Winter Knits. Appreciate that. I had to get my wife used to that, so that was a challenge.
I know.
Julia, that's a good point here. Julia Oliver says, what about using solvent to drip the paint? Again, we've basically answered that. But what you're doing is you're creating a paint that's going to be a little bit high PVC, because any of the oil in the paint is going to be absorbed into the bottom layer of the paint, and you could potentially underbind that paint. Certainly, it's going to be matte, and it's going to cause a lot of sinking in, and there's some issues with very, very matte paint.
But again, people now, we see so many people just dripping and they leave as it is. They don't cover that, and so then it will be just covered with varnish, and so that's perfectly fine. So if that's what you want to do, but if you think, then you will put layers and layers and layers, so then expect sinking in, of course, because it's obviously takes so much solvent to have that drip.
And lastly, this video, it's a live streaming video, but it'll be on the YouTube channel. So that's where we're at. So you can always see this at a later time. So no problem there. Ree has one question. Thank you.
Hi, Ree, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Can
you
you explain that the curing paints no longer emit VOCs? VOCs are volatile organic compounds. Oil paint typically doesn't emit volatile organic compounds. Mostly just solvents do that. And so if you use just pure oil, you're really not, there may be a very small amount with some oils, some of the volatile organic compounds, such as possibly safflower oil or walnut oil. And there's some data about that in a study by the Smithsonian, but not so much about VOCs, but about volatilization or the shrinkage of these kinds of oils. But linseed oil does not, and so only with solvents. So solvents become a problem with VOCs, really nothing else.
Yeah, 3698, yes. Cold wax these days is big, and I guess we should have another AMA about that. So maybe after oils, we will talk about waxes.
So we're still getting some questions. We'll take one winter knits because of your appreciation of my beard. What about using fast drying medium like Italian varnish on top of a paste paint straight out of the tube? But is this a previous initial layer takes longer to dry as it has no varnish? Again, check your paint, make sure it's hard dry before you apply a new paint layer. So we'll go into all of that in another episode of the Artist Materials Advisor, because it's going to really take too long to go into that at this point in time. But yeah, as long as that underlying paint layer is dry, you can apply a new paint layer, and just just make sure it is very hard dry.
Oh, you see, now we have voting who is for, who is against your beard. So, because it took for me 10 years to shave him, now he suddenly has this beard, and I agree with you guys. Okay, let him keep a little bit.
All right, so I think we're all done here, and we want to appreciate everybody hanging on with us to the bitter end here, and we will hope to see you at the next AMA later on this month.
Please, ladies, please, we don't exclude guys. Guys, you can send us your videos too, so because we can use any videos on our color notes, that would be great. And so then the best ones, of course, we will give gift certificates. And so, but ladies, you have only short time. We need to prepare that newsletter too. So let's say until May 5th, you have
March.
March 5th. You have
We've
your
extended International Women's Day for the next couple of months.
Yes, we do. Just for women. And so send your videos, short videos, who you are, what you're doing, how do you like
Your
our
artwork
colors.
too.
And yes, absolutely. And we will feature you in our newsletter for International Women's Day. And if we love that and we have a lot of your videos, we will just do the special color notes. Thank you very much. That was fun. We'll love to spend time with you, and see you next time on our AMA. We will announce where it will be, and it will be about oils.
Yeah. Bye now.
Bye now.